distinct honor of welcoming one of our own, a student who graduated from UCR just last spring, LoCascio. And I'll just be introducing him very briefly. I could go on and on, but I don't want to cut into his time. Before I get started on the introduction, just in terms of format, we try to end in about an hour, so if you could speak for about 45 minutes or so and leave some time for questions, and people can sort of ask clarificatory questions during the talk, but otherwise reserve your questions for after Chris has finished speaking. So, back to background information on our speaker. Chris is the founder and president of the Foundation for Innovation and Creative Solutions, also abbreviated as FICS or FIX. This is a new national public policy organization focused on solving colleges' greatest challenges by rethinking the fundamentals of our higher education system. Prior to founding FIX, Chris had started FixUc in 2011, a University of California system-wide students group charged with addressing the university's funding crisis. In January of 2012, the group released the revolutionary FixUc student investment model, which was a drastic overhaul of college funding that has since inspired state and federal legislation. The model simultaneously eliminated the need for upfront tuition and student debt, instead incorporating the contribution of a small percentage of students' income after graduation for a set period of time. This was actually written up in the national media. I remember reading a story about it in the New York Times last year. So the release of the model was met with widespread national media attention and interest from university administrators and lawmakers alike. Christopher graduated from UC Riverside just last year, as I mentioned, with a BA in political science and English. That, I think, was his greatest regret, that he didn't major in public policy, but he's when you started, it probably didn't exist yet, but he's steeped in public policy, and I think Chris is a phenomenal role model for what you can do even while you're in college. You can get involved in solving some of the big challenges facing society today. During his undergraduate career, Chris served as editor-in-chief of the Highlander newspaper, KUCR radio host, and Jazz Connect peer educator. He has also interned for the Center for National Policy, the Truman National Security Project, and the Mayor of Riverside. So we are delighted to have him here with us back today at UCR. Please join me in giving Chris LoCascio a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me in the back? I'm going to forego using a mic. I don't think it's working, and I like to be active in the room when I'm talking. So if you can't hear me, feel free to let me know. Don't be shy. I'm happy to raise my voice or whatever, but hopefully you won't have to yell. Thank you, Dean Diolalitar, for that excellent introduction. It feels really good to be back here. I took classes in this room. And a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today, I got started just across the quad over in the hub while working for the Highlander here. But let's get started. The name of my talk today is America 2.0, Innovation in Public Policy and its Birth on Campus. What I'm going to be covering is the history of FixUc, which is a student group that I founded here at UCR back in 2011 in the face of the UC's budget crisis. I'm going to talk about the concept behind it, how it works, how we developed it as students. Then I'm going to talk about what thinking tech means for developing public policy and how, when approaching public policy in the 21st century, I think a lot of us are going to be thinking a little bit differently, and part of that is going to be involving technology. And number three, I'm going to be talking about what it means to be a policy engineer. I consider myself a policy engineer, and I think hopefully by the end of this talk, you will consider yourself one too. So in preparing for this talk, I had been thinking a lot about technology in regards to public policy. A few months ago, I started taking a course, a Stanford online course called How to Start a Startup. And I was doing it because I'm starting a nonprofit organization, a public policy organization, and I wanted to get some inside scoops on what it takes to build a new organization. And I thought that, okay, a tech company might be an interesting way of framing them. And I did it for like the managerial organizational purpose, just to kind of understand, okay, how do you hire people, how do you run an organization that's innovative and creative. But what I didn't expect was, when they were talking about developing products, whether it's apps or a new service or whatever, I started to get a ton of public policy ideas. And I did not expect that going into it. And it felt kind of weird. I felt like I'm crazy. Like, what are you doing, Chris? It's like, public policy is not a product necessarily. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop getting new ideas. And in preparing for this talk, I was kind of nervous. I thought, okay, Chris, you're crazy. Like, what are you thinking? Until I read an article in Governing Magazine last week that said this: the models that have come out of the startup world have focused on creating value for customers. Refocusing our efforts on adding value rather than simply getting things out the door could be the next revolution in government. That was in an article called Making City Hall Leaner by Nigel Jacob. And all of a sudden, I'm not crazy. Other people are thinking the same way. Other people are looking to the tech industry, looking to Silicon Valley, looking to startups as a sort of model for innovation in the 21st century. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. How many people have used one of these? I'm not talking about a telephone, I'm talking about a rotary telephone where you have to move your finger like this in order to dial. Okay, there's only a couple hands up. This is our public policy today. These are our systems. These are the things that we have to do in order to have a functioning society, having functioning government, having functioning services. This is outdated telephone. Now stay with me throughout the course of this talk. I'm going to be making references between technology and public policy. Stay with me, I promise it'll make sense. Now, I think for most public policy folks, policy wonks in DC, not the people in this room, but I'm talking about most public policy people, if you were to ask them, how do you improve on this for the 21st century? I'm afraid that most people, I think, would come up with something like this. This is an iPod with a rotary phone click wheel, rather than something like this. I think too often we lose sight of what is the very purpose of the things that we're developing. What are the solutions that we're trying to develop? And we're so attached to the different gears and the different ways in which we interact with them. But I think what we need to focus on is what is the very purpose of the things that we're developing. And by getting rid of everything else and just focusing on that, I think we can start to come up with some innovative solutions. So I'm going to be digging into that today. So like I mentioned before, I started a new nonprofit public policy organization. And so when you start a new organization, people ask you for your pitch. What is your elevator speech? What in a minute or two is what you can tell people to get the gist of what it is that you're doing. And most people, they talk about what it is that they're doing. They talk about some sort of product that they're doing, what is new about them. But I think so much of what I'm doing has to do with the way people think. It has to do with getting people into a mindset that is open to innovation, open to new ideas. And so instead of giving a traditional pitch, I ask a question. If you were to design a system of higher education from the ground up, would it look anything like it does today? The reason I ask this question is three things. It introduces this concept of a design. We're designing the public policy, like we're designing a product, like we're designing a phone that works nicely within your hand, that you can feel and that does the kinds of things that you want to do. It establishes a common ground that there are problems with the system. Because of the hundreds of people who I've asked this question, not one has answered yes. Not one has said that the ideal higher education model is what we have now. And so already there we've established a common ground that we can build on. And third, it starts them to think ideal. What are we working towards? What are we trying to accomplish? Now, once you've got someone thinking that way, once you have someone thinking the way that you are, everything else becomes a lot easier. I used to make a mistake. I would ask that question at the end of interviews, at the end of meetings. And I would see the way that their face changes. They would go from scratching their head to, like, you want to get them to, yeah, I get it. That's where you want to get them. If you're developing something new and innovative, you want them to understand it and to get in that mindset. And that's what asking them a question can do. And that's the way that I think about my work now. Fix is a tech company that designs public policy. But before we get into that, the first thing that you have to do if you're going to tackle something like this is you have to think small. Facebook. Billions of people across the world have Facebook accounts. It is the way that we stay connected with one another. But it started out in a dorm room in Harvard, just connecting Harvard students. Small. They focused on what they did it well, and then it grew and grew and grew naturally. Amazon. You can buy literally anything that you can imagine on Amazon today. You can have it on your doorstep tomorrow. They started out by just selling books. Just books. FixUc was my organization before Fix. And what we focused on was specifically the UC. How do we fix the University of California? And so that's what I want to start talking about. Most of you have probably seen this picture. This was taken at UC Davis in 2011. What was going on were the Occupy protests. The state of California had announced that it was going to be cutting the University of California's budget by 1/3. And what that meant was huge tuition increases for students. It was national news. It was international news. People were talking about this stuff. Outside my office at the Highlander, I had just been selected the editor-in-chief. Outside were protests, Occupy protests, people walking by every 15 minutes or so. I could hear that as I was thinking about all these issues. One of the first headlines that I had to publish and inform students of was that your tuition is going up. That's a lot to bear when you're only a few weeks on the job. Now, one of the things that most newspapers tend to do in a situation like this is they'll publish editorials. They'll call people out. They'll be like, okay, so there are things that we need to do. We need new solutions. I can't tell you how many editorials I've read from different newspapers, from the LA Times, the New York Times, whatever, saying we need new solutions to this problem. And everybody was in agreement about that, but nobody had an actual solution. So in the midst of all this, I called up Governor Brown's office and I asked, what are you doing to fix this problem? Tuition is skyrocketing. There's lines at the financial aid office. This is unsustainable. What the governor's office did was pointed the finger at the UC saying they need to cut administrative bloat, they need to make cuts, they need to make things more efficient. And so I called up the University of California office of the president and I asked, okay, so what are you doing? And they pointed the finger right back at the state saying, they need to stop cutting us, they need to invest in us more. It's all their fault, our hands are tied, you can't do anything. So when both entities that are responsible for this crisis are pointing the finger at each other, what's left to do? And as a student, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I can't publish another article saying we need to have creative solutions. Everybody knows that. And so we decided to create one ourselves. Starting with the editorial board of the Highlander and then eventually roping in students from every campus across the University of California, we started FixUc, which was a student group that spent 9 months in 2011 developing an entirely new model for higher education. We brought in PhD students at Berkeley to crunch numbers. We brought in activists from UCI and UCLA. We brought in folks from everywhere, got organized, and tackled this problem as students for students. In January 2012, the University of California Regents, the governing board of the UC, met on this campus just a floor above my office at the Highlander. And I saw this as a huge opportunity. They're coming here to us. We have to make an impact. And so we released the proposal a week before they met, and this started to happen. I started getting phone calls day in and day out. I would have to leave class multiple times each day to do interviews with CBS or Time Magazine, because everybody was looking at the students who were finally tackling this issue. It was crazy. Until finally it got so much coverage that the Regents had to talk about it in the board meeting the following week. And what happened over the ensuing years was things blew up. I started getting calls from other states, other institutions, public, private, big, small. Everybody was looking at this model thinking, okay, this is where we're going, this is what we're doing. This is what we need to do to finally solve this tuition and funding crisis. And so what were the core problems? I'm going to start talking about the model now, I'm going to get into it, and interwoven within this I'm going to talk about how we all can start tackling some new problems as well. So what were the core problems that we were trying to face? And also, if someone could like raise their hand when we're getting close to time, maybe 10 minutes left, just let me know. The core problems were these. Rapidly increasing tuition for the foreseeable future. The trajectory of rising tuition in the UC and across the country, but specifically in the UC, looked a steep line like this. And that's scary. Student debt was at an all-time high then, it's at an all-time high now. We saw things like the middle class being cut out with less financial aid and more students having to take on bigger loans. And we saw the UC just having a lack of revenue. They weren't getting enough money from the state. Because of that, they had to increase tuition. The way I framed it was the UC was on a paycheck-to-paycheck relationship with an unreliable donor. And so with all these problems, most people thought, okay, these are mutually exclusive issues. How do you reconcile raising tuition with getting more funding for the UC? I mean, you have to do one or the other, right? That's what everybody told them. Nope. What we did was we created a long-term overhaul of the UC funding model by completely rethinking how we think about higher education. And we did so by doing this. We eliminated the upfront costs that you have for attending the university. So everybody sitting in this room, if you're a student, you paid however much for this quarter, $3,000, $4,000, whatever. If you couldn't pay for that, you either had financial aid or you took out a loan. Through the FixUc model, there's no upfront cost whatsoever. If you have earned the grade to attend the UC, you get to attend, without worrying about room and board, without worrying about tuition or anything like that. And there are no student loans because you don't have some sort of price to pay. Instead, the way that we pay for this education, the way that we make it work, is by contributing a small percentage of your income for a set period of time. And the way that we came up with this was we were trying to figure out, it doesn't really make that much sense to charge students at a time in their lives when they aren't making any money. I mean, if you think about it, you would never, if you're starting a business, you would never charge someone for something that, a price that they can't afford, for something that they need. Like that just doesn't make any sense. So instead we found that if you instead move it to when you're actually earning an income, there are a lot of really amazing things that you can do with it that make sense for a lot of people and allows more people to be able to attend without having to worry about not being able to afford it. We did things like we looked into what is the typical amount of student loan, or the typical duration, and we found that it's usually 20 to 30 years. And so within working in that context, we looked at Department of Labor statistics, at how much people spend per month on different things. How much are they saving? How much are they spending on a mortgage or rent? How much are they spending on food? How much are they spending on transportation? And we looked at that at different income levels. We looked at the graduation rates of the UC. We looked at the income levels of UC graduates, the low end, the middle, the high end, late career, early career. We looked at how much funding the UC needs, how much each student can contribute. And we arrived at this 5% for 20 years after looking at all of this data. And we found that it was a matter of finding a happy medium. If we increase the duration during which we have this repayment period, we could decrease the percentage that people are paying. Or if we shorten it, we can increase it. It's just a game of proportions. And we found that the sweet spot was 5% for 20 years.
Can I ask a clarification?
Yeah, sure.
5% for 20 years up to a certain maximum, or you have to pay 5%?
No. And so that was one of the innovative things about this plan.
Because if you end up getting a student ends up getting a job in a hedge fund and makes
Right.
$200,000 a year.
Right. So one of the things that we developed, and I'll talk about tweaking later, is the concept of refining your work. We found that after we released the original proposal, that we needed to work in a threshold. We needed to, like, if you're going to be the next Mark Zuckerberg and you're going to earn billions of dollars, you would end up paying an absurd amount for your education. We found that those kinds of people would not get insured. We also realized that there needs to be a low income threshold as well. Like, if you are just getting by, you're working part-time, you just graduated, 5% of your income is a whole lot. Way too much to be contributing at that point in your career. So we have low income and high income thresholds. Up to earning, you would only be assessed up to the first $200,000 per year that you are earning. So it would be 5% or whatever percent of the first $200,000 that you're earning each year, and then after that you would not be assessed. So that would be the high income threshold. You would only contribute a certain amount. On the low income side, if you are earning 150% above the poverty line or below, you're not contributing anything. It's almost as though you're unemployed. You don't have to contribute. And then it's graduated up from there. So it's not like if you're earning, you know, $30,000 and $1, you're all of a sudden paying 5%.
No, but my question was slightly different.
Okay.
So you have, suppose the notion of you sort of look at $13,000 a year tuition for 4 years, $52,000. Someone pays 5% up to the point that they have paid back the $52,000, or they just continue to pay 5% indefinitely for 20 years, even if they have gone well above the $52,000 debt
So
that they have, notional debt.
There is no price tag.
Okay.
And I'll get into why that is later. There's some sort of technical reasons why that works that way. But one of the reasons was we looked at how much you would be paying over the life of a student loan, a typical student loan at the UC. And we found that in most cases, under the FixUc plan, even with this model, you would end up paying less for your education than a comparable student loan. Because with interest accruing and the amount that you would be paying over a certain time, you're not paying a sticker price. You usually aren't. Because once that interest accrues, it accrues the day that you accept it. If you're a senior and you started accepting student loans your freshman year, you've already accrued a ton of interest. And so when taking that into account, this makes a lot more sense. But on the flip side, there are a lot of ways to pay for your education. We didn't just want to throw another one out there without tackling the basic issue that keeps tuition prices from rising, and that's just the fact that the UC needs a certain amount of money to function, to provide the education for its students. And so what we did was we made sure that by doing this model, we'd also grow the revenue of the UC, so it could recover from these state cuts, and would be able to accommodate a growing number of students who each year are applying to the UC and being turned away. Because right now, the UC gets more applicants than it ever has year after year after year. And it's been like that for the past 5 or 6 years. But we're not growing enrollment nearly enough to keep up with it. Now, if California is going to be in a good position 20 years from now, we need to be able to educate those students. And the way that we're going to do that is by growing enrollment, and that takes some money. Now, I briefly mentioned tweaking earlier, and the thresholds that I talked about were a tweak that we made to the plan after we had released it. But rewinding a little bit, the FixUc plan in itself wasn't necessarily completely original. And I know that. But before I get into that, I want to talk about another example. Steve Jobs, I think we're all familiar with that. He was on the screen a few minutes earlier. An article published by Malcolm Gladwell in the New Yorker described the actual real value of Steve Jobs was not in his inventing any sort of device. He didn't invent the smartphone. He didn't invent the tablet computer. But what he did was he tweaked it to a point where it was actually purposeful, it was meaningful, and it was something that actually created value in our lives. This quote: "Jobs' sensibility was editorial, not invented. His gift lay in taking what was in front of him, the tablet, the stylus, so the iPad, and ruthlessly refining it." And I think most of our jobs in public policy are a matter of tweaking. There's going to be some invention involved, some completely original ideas that we're going to think of, but for the most part, it's going to be a matter of tweaking. And so FixUc was a little bit of both. the concept of paying a percentage of your income after you graduate was not unheard of. There have been examples in history of this kind of thing happen. In the UK and Australia, for instance, they have similar ways to repay your student loans. There have also been other theories that have been discussed by Milton Friedman. The Yale Business School tried a similar program in the 70s. Robert Reich, who presented here at the Business School of Public Policy a few weeks ago, as well as a federal pays-you-earn program where if you take out a student loan, you can pay back 10 to 15% of your income to pay back your student loans, but interest is still accruing. So this wasn't an entirely original idea, but certain aspects of it we tweaked to make it something that was meaningful and that would actually work in the 21st century. And so what are the benefits to the student in this kind of model? It allows all students, regardless of family income, to attend without any upfront cost. No longer do you look at the sticker price of an institution or UC and be like, I can't afford that. Or think, I need to do something else, I need to struggle to make ends meet to be able to get my education so I can then enter a career where I can have a sustainable income. It eliminates the burden on families. If you're born into a family of low income, even if you've earned the grade, you are already set back when it comes to getting your education. And it eliminates that burden. One of the unsung sort of cool things about the FixUc plan was it was in the university's best interest to make sure that you were employed after graduation and that you were earning a solid income. Because if you are doing better financially, the UC is doing better financially. And all of a sudden, by aligning those incentives, the UC can start providing things for you that are far and above the kinds of career services that we see now, because it's in its best interest. And so we could see things where the UC would use its extensive portfolio of private or public contacts to help make sure that its students are getting jobs. And that kind of robust support of the University of California system that has graduated hundreds of thousands of amazing individuals who are now all over the globe. Having that kind of support is something that would be invaluable to a student. And when we were developing this in the absolute depths of the recession, that was one of the most attractive things about it, was all of a sudden having that incentive and having those priorities aligned. And then lastly, having an affordable contribution base on your income. You pay based on what you earn. It's inherently affordable. And if you can't afford it, then you don't have to pay. What are the benefits to the UC? Why would the UC do this? If they're getting their funds either way, if they're getting their funds guaranteed through student loans, why would this be attractive? Well, it generates stable, predictable revenue for the UC. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the headlines, but right now the state and the UC are engaged in a brutal battle to figure out how much funding the UC is going to get this year. This is 2015. I was talking about this stuff in 2011. It hasn't gotten any better yet. It is extremely difficult to run a multi-billion-dollar institution like the UC when you don't know how much funding you're going to get next year. How do you make any sort of long-term plans? How do you develop your institution in a way that will be able to be sustainable for the next 20 years, 30 years, when you can't even think 6 months to a year down the line and know where you're going to be? This creates that. Through this model, you can know exactly how much the UC is going to get from year to year, be able to plan, be able to build, make changes. It maintains a strong long-term relationship with alumni. So all of a sudden, because you have that relationship where students are contributing a portion of their income after they graduate, there is that connection with the university that lasts. There's a decreased vulnerability to fluctuating state funds and an opportunity to pioneer a new funding model, which I think the UC is set up for. UC is a pioneer in higher education. So how would the transition work? This isn't something that would just happen overnight. The way it would work, and this is specific to the UC, is that the UC has a program called Return to Aid, or Blue and Gold, which is a pot of money, essentially, that is collected from the amount of money that you pay in tuition that is used to fund the tuition of low-income students. The way it would work is a portion of those students would pilot the program. They would go through, they would get their education, everything would be paid for, tuition, room and board, whatnot. But once they graduate, they would start paying a small percentage of their income. As they would do that, that pot of money grows, and as more graduates graduate, that's more money in the pot that can pay for more students to attend with no upfront cost whatsoever. Now, this is a long-term transition plan. It would happen over 9 years. But by year 9, every student would be on this plan to be able to attend without any upfront cost. Now, how would that be practically implemented in the real world? How would we make this happen? And why hasn't it happened already? If it's such a good idea, Chris, and you're still focusing on this 4 years later, what's standing in the way? Okay, well, the first thing is Congress. I feel like a cold chill just came over me when I mentioned Congress. Believe me, I felt it. I've been in Congress fighting for this. What we need is a bill establishing a program with the Department of Education, which would allow an institution like the UC or any other system to enter in and say, okay, we want to do this plan. We accept a set of regulations to make sure that this institution isn't, say, pushing all students to be business majors because they're going to earn the most money, and that way we're going to earn the most money. So making sure the integrity of the system and the model are in place. But by doing so, they get to accept the services of the IRS to collect the funds from graduates. If they are in the state, leave the country, the IRS is the institution in this country that can collect those funds regardless of where you are. And the way this bill would work, it's a really simple bill, is it would essentially create a line between the IRS and an institution where the IRS would send the money it collects directly to the institution. That's all it is. It's really simple.
Is there any example of the IRS putting a lien on your wages this way for any other program in the country?
Not that I know of. Not that I can think of it off the top of my head.
I have a feeling the Supreme Court might object to it.
No, because when an student agrees to attend the University of California under this plan, signing the contract, accepting these terms, would be like a human capital contract, which functions very similar in that someone would put up the funds for your education or whatever in agreement with you contributing a certain percentage of your income after you graduate. So from my conversations with politicians and lawmakers, I don't think that would be necessarily an issue. Second, when institutions agree, okay, I talked about this, the IRS collaboration, and then finally working with institutions across the country to develop their version. So, if I'm going to go to the University of Ohio, what percentage is it going to be, like 3% for 20 years or 25 years or whatever? We can change those things depending on the needs of the institution. How would an institution fund it? Because not every university has a big pot of money like the UC and its return to aid program to get it started. And then what would the duration? How am I doing on time?
Another 10 minutes?
Another 10 minutes. Okay. And so now I'm going to dive back into the technology thing and talk about how this is all going to wrap up, intertwining. So when we talk about public policy, quite often we talk about how things work. If we're creating, say, a service for people, how does that service work? Does it function? But we don't often enough think about what it's like to be a citizen, what it's like to be a person interacting with that service, interacting with that policy. How does it affect me? And one of the benefits to thinking about public policy in terms of technology is thinking about the user experience. If I'm a policymaker, I have to think about my users, the constituents, people of the United States. This is another quote from that same governing article. For too long, we in government have built portals, forms, and processes for the people we serve that are hard to use and thus prevent people from doing the things that they need to do. So, how many people in this room have been to the DMV before? Okay, I don't know of anybody who gives the DMV glowing reviews. Okay, it's something we traditionally dread.
Yeah.
yet most of us have to interact with it in some way. That is an example of a bad user experience. Take a look at this website. It's from the Department of Defense. Their Freedom of Information Act office. The Freedom of Information Act is what allows us as citizens to get honest, truthful information from our government. This is the site that you have to use in order to get any information. That is not a website I would ever want to use. It looks like it was built 20 years ago, and it might have well been, but it hasn't been updated since. This is the National Weather Service. Try to read that map. This is horrible. I took these screenshots yesterday. Okay, it's 2015. America 2.0 is that concept of taking the next step, improving that user experience, inventing and tweaking to a way that our public policy is really not only meeting the needs of us, not only being able to tell what the weather is on the National Weather Service website, but doing it in a way that is actually helpful to use, enjoyable to use, works well, is not something that I'm never going to want to go to that website ever again. I don't want to think about public policy. And that comes to us, the policy engineers, the designers, the craftsmen. Our work needs to focus on three different things. Efficiency. How efficient are our public policies? How effective are they? And what is the experience like to actually interact with them as a person? How do we develop them? When we look at software, if you look at something like Twitter or Facebook or whatever, if you look at where they started, they were very simple web pages that focused on something very specific. And over time, they get more bloated and crazy. I know, how many people are on Facebook in this room? If you look at your Facebook page now, it's like a million things are going on. It's like really intimidating. It's so bloated. And it's at the point now when things need to be simplified, things need to be focused, we need to get back to what is the core function of these things. And policy is the same way. Things get bloated with bureaucracy, with different costs, with red tape. What we need to do is build, measure, and learn. We need to build up a prototype. What is the next solution going to be? How are we going to fix the DMV? What is the purpose of the DMV? There's certain transportation services that we need to get. We need to get driver's licenses. We need to make sure that people are earning their driver's licenses. People are, all sorts of different transportation issues. How do we accomplish those things in a more efficient way? In a better way? In a way that I'm going to actually not dread going to and using. That's not going to take hours and hours of my time that I could otherwise be productive and contributing to the economy. We'll measure how people interact with those things, and then we'll learn from it and start the process over. And who's going to do it? So, what happened with FixUc was, we were just students. I was sitting in the same seats that you were. The people who were otherwise in charge of taking care of these things were too preoccupied with the matters of the day, things that are more pressing. If you're a politician, you have to make sure that A, the potholes are filled, or A, this policy has to go into effect, or whatever. You don't have time necessarily to be thinking about what are things going to look like 10 years from now. That's not necessarily the point. As a student, you are seated next to other potential people who can help you solve these problems. If there's any place in the world where I would want to start solving these problems, it's at a university when you're surrounded by amazing faculty members who could have expertise in anything that you would want to solve, with other smart young people around you. I kind of wish I was back, because it's an incredible experience and an incredible opportunity to do these kind of things. There's no other time in your life when you're going to have such a diverse range of intelligent people around you. Every class that you step into, you're with a new group of people who could bring in different expertise, different skill sets, different ideologies, different perspectives that can help you tackle these problems. I don't get that now that I graduated, unfortunately. Find classmates who share your passions and develop a solution. There could be someone in this room who's really passionate about transportation. There could be someone who's really passionate about criminal justice and wants to fix the bad user experience that people are facing across the country when it comes to interacting with the police. That's a bad user experience. People aren't happy with it. You can fix it. Think of a better way to accomplish the primary goal of criminal justice or transportation or poverty or what have you. There are experts nearby, like I said, faculty members. Go knock on their doors, send them emails. But lastly, the thing that I recognize now in retrospect that I had going for me as a student, and the reason that I was able to get all this coverage was, it's a good story when a student all of a sudden comes up with this big, amazing plan to solve things. You have that in your back pocket. And if you want to get attention out there, if you want to get the word out, use it. Because once you graduate, you lose that. And who knows, someone in this room could do that.
All right.
We could have fixed it. Please feel free to contact me. This is my email address. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Thank you so much.
We have time for a few questions. I'm sure many of you have questions for Chris about the idea, about how he came up with this idea when he was in college. Who's going to break the ice? Back there? Anyone? Okay.
So you talked about your specific experiences with your past policy that you created. Is there anything that you're working on currently now that's different from FixUc?
Good question. Okay, so I don't know if I clarified that enough. But Fix, my new organization, is essentially taking this FixUc model and working to apply it nationally. So when institutions call me up from across the country, and states call me up and they're like, hey, we like this model. How do we make it work for us? That's part of what we're doing. We're doing more development on that. We are creating an algorithm where if you're a university administrator, you can type in data like what are your graduation rates, how much do your graduates earn at different points in their careers, how much revenue do you need, all that stuff, and it'll pump out, what percentage would you need to have students contribute for what period of time. We would help with those kinds of things. And that's our goal for 2015. But after that, we're going to be focusing on community colleges. We're going to be taking the thinking that we've applied to solving issues at the university level and start thinking about issues that community colleges face. They're very different than what universities are facing. Affordability isn't as big of an issue, it is part of it. But access is the big thing. When you try to get classes at a community college, most often it will take an absurd amount of time to get your degree to move on, move forward. Meanwhile, there's some stiff competition between for-profit institutions. I don't know if you guys follow the Corinthian colleges and what's going on with them going bankrupt. Tons of students being left with their student loans but having no degree to show for it. These are the kinds of problems that we need to tackle next. And so, yeah, community colleges are the next step.
Other than creating like a model of policy, the university system or nationwide for colleges, what are the other challenges to actually implement? What challenges are you having to implement that as a policy nationwide?
I mean, it's a political one, I think, at its core, and that's something that I've learned by doing. Although I was a political science major, they don't necessarily teach you, or at least not in any class that I had, how to, say, talk to folks of different ideologies. So when I sit down with a Republican lawmaker or I sit down with a Democratic lawmaker, I have to talk to them differently if I'm talking about one certain policy. And I learned how to do that. And that was a very strategic thing that I had to do, was trial and error. I got to some heated things before I was able to figure out how to do it. And also it's just a matter of just resources and time. And I mean, I started FixUc when I was a second year at UCR. I still had several more years of schooling to go after that. And meanwhile, this thing blew up nationally, and I wasn't able to keep up. And so what I'm doing now is making sure that I can keep up and be there. And so having that sort of ability to keep up and have that presence, if you're a student and doing something like that, having enough people around you to delegate and to spread out different jobs and things like that can really help to kind of keep up. with everything, and that's something that I learned later on this. So last year I spent some time in DC, and I started the process of what is it like to get a bill passed. And I literally did that. I got some meetings with lawmakers, one U.S. Senator and two members of Congress, representatives. And how many people are familiar with Schoolhouse Rock, On Just a Bill, sitting on Capitol Hill or whatever? Yeah, it's not nearly as fun as that song. It can take years to get a simple little transaction between the IRS and institutions to actually happen. What I thought was, and it is a very, very simple little thing. There are possibilities to get that with the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, which is coming up. There are a million different ways that this can be done. One of the things that I encountered was if you mention the IRS or taxes at all in Congress, people just like turn the other way and run away because nobody wants to work with the IRS. And so one of the things that I had to struggle with was explain how simple this transaction was. What I learned was there have been issues in the past with the IRS and disclosing people's information through bills that have been passed. So much so that it's almost toxic for lawmakers to want to do anything with it. And so that was something that I had to kind of figure out as well. Is like, how do I approach this in a friendly way and scare people? And so that's something I'm still figuring out with the new law.
Rachel.
Have you considered going another route than the IRS, like maybe through the actual like UC system, if you just start with the UCs instead of going through the IRS? Because I mean, with a Republican Congress, you're not going to get them to say, oh yeah, taxes, let's do it, you know, and people's information that, you know, they're not comfortable with that kind of stuff. So, and I'm just thinking that, like, if we want to see this happen in the near future, the people that are in Congress are not going to be very happy with the IRS being involved. And so have you ever considered doing the UC route instead?
What do you mean by UC route? I mean,
Like the UC billing the students directly instead of...
but once the students are gone, what leverage does UC have over them? That's the problem with enforcing it.
Yeah.
Because once they have started working, it's very difficult to go after them and get the money back from them.
Yeah. But if you work with lawmakers on a way to solve that...
It's a good question. It's a good question. So one of the things that I did in the ensuing months after we released FixUc was I was invited up to Sacramento to meet with the leadership in the California state government, the California State Senate and the Assembly. And we sat around and we talked about how this might work, how we might be able to do something like that. And we found that the California Franchise Tax Board, which is essentially California's version of the IRS for California, does not have the authority to be able to follow people around if they leave the state or if they leave the country. Only the IRS has that already built in, and something that they do every day. And we found that there was no reasonable way that we were going to be able to make that work using just the resources of California and be able to expect any sort of participation. That continues to be one of the main.
But I think what Rachel was talking about was
Just
not even a franchise tax board, just UC billing.
Yeah.
And the problem with all of those things is that the default rate is very high because they can't really force. They can send collectors after you and all that, but eventually, if you want to default on your loan, you can.
Yeah.
And this way, the IRS is sort of the ultimate authority, and they are going to take the money out of your paycheck, whether you like it or not. But I'm not sure. I mean, you're sure that this would fly with the? I somehow find it difficult to believe that the IRS would be able to garner sort of people's wages and collect 5% under such a scheme.
We can. That wasn't even the issue that I was facing. Yeah. It was just a matter of getting enough people on board to even see that's the trouble, is like getting people to even, this is going back to the pitch, getting people to even listen and understand what it is that you're talking about. Because when I request a meeting with a lawmaker and I mention anything about dealing with the IRS, all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, I don't even want to take that meeting. So that's one of the big issues. It's just getting them to hear it out, and then when they do, it's like, it's not nearly as big of a
Any other questions? Yes, Nikki?
Sophia?
I'm Sophia, sorry.
I had a question about the model.
Yeah.
Is there a contingency plan for revenue when there's a recession or low economic development?
Such a good question. Such a good question. Okay. I wish
Can
I
you
would
repeat
cover
the question? Or?
Is there a contingency plan in case there's like a recession or like a dip in the economy? So when we first calculated the plan, the first version of the plan, we wanted to really make it clear that in a recession, because we were in a recession at that time, we wanted to make it clear that regardless of what happened with the economy, this would stay afloat. And so what we did was we calculated the model with 40% unemployment. That is far and away higher than even what we had during the Great Depression. But we did it because we wanted to show people like, hey, look, like we can make this work. And that's one of the great things about using a percentage is that it is flexible and it adapts to what the economy is. When you're working with like an actual number amount, that can mean anything at any point in time. With inflation, with changes in the economy, it is not reactive, it is not flexible, but a percentage is. And so when we tweaked the model to add these high income and low income thresholds, we moved the unemployment rate down to, I believe it was 10 to 15%, which is even still far higher than what it is for most UC graduates. Still a very conservative estimate, but just to make it clear that this is a robust plan that can handle any economy that you throw at it.
I was having lunch with Chris and I said this is almost like a sharecropping model where in the old days landlords would lease their land to farmers and the farmer would have to pay back a certain percentage of his
I never thought about
produce.
it that way.
And this is like sharecropping basically where the
Now,
risk
taking a
is
step back
borne.
from the tech looking at it, so let's talk about like farming. Okay.
Any other questions? Yes.
I wanted to ask more so about the process
Yeah.
of, like, for example, setting up your startup
Yeah.
and like kind of what that experience was like, and in particular, if you ever faced any kind of like, I think maybe the best word is kind of like cynicism, because like, oh, it's just some graduate or undergraduate
Yeah.
from UCR, like
Yeah.
what are they really doing?
Yeah. Both amazing questions. The first is like in regards to starting up the organization. What I've unfortunately had to spend most of my time doing since I graduated was the inner workings of starting a nonprofit organization. Not actually doing the kind of work that I want to do, doing the policy work. Just filling out and completing like 1023, 501c3 nonprofit information with the IRS and federal paperwork and whatnot takes a long time, having to have a lawyer work on all that kind of stuff. But it helps to have people working with you on it. FixUc never got that kind of status. We never needed it. I basically funded everything through working 2 jobs on campus. And so things went a little bit smoothly there, and we just kind of focused on the work. But now that we're going legit and national and doing fundraising and things like that, we have to go about that process. In regards to the cynicism, I mean, that ties into what the biggest obstacle I was talking about earlier, and why my pitch is a question, because it kind of strips away that cynicism a little bit. When talking about public policy, it is very, very, very easy to be cynical, to be pessimistic, to think, okay, we only have solution A and solution B, and that's all we have. And that's what I was facing when we started FixUc, was either you raise tuition and we keep the UC afloat, or we keep tuition the same and the UC is going to tank, the quality is going to go under. And that's all we had. And I knew that wasn't really all that we had, but nobody else was doing anything about it. And so the best way to combat cynicism and pessimism is to be optimistic and show people that they can be optimistic. And by producing something like that, that's how you ultimately get people to think different. A former professor of mine, I took Ray Connect class my first year. It was on China, yeah. Oh.
I don't dare ask my question yet.
Because if
No,
he
I was
doesn't
going to
know
ask
why.
about the rationale for the upper limit on the 5%. You used Mark Zuckerberg as an example there, and makes $1 zillion, so 5% of $1 zillion seems like too much to ask from Mark Zuckerberg. But if I understood you correctly, your reason was that people like Zuckerberg coming into college wouldn't want to sign up for a program that would commit them to 5% of a zillion. But my problem with that argument is that Zuckerberg doesn't know when he signs up at the beginning that this is going to happen. And then professors don't make that kind of money, but if I were to imagine myself in a Zuckerberg position, maybe I wouldn't be so opposed to giving 5% of my zillion to my alma mater. So I wonder, what the rationale for an upper limit is.
I thought the exact same way when we created the model. I did, and then I had reality hit me over the head when we released it, and so many people were saying, I would never participate in this. This would never happen. Lawmakers telling me I would never subject people to this. That's why it was a tweak and not part of the original proposal, because I thought the same way that you did, and that was a tweak that we had to make. That was a compromise that we had to make. And over time, I've kind of come to understand that there are a lot of people who are not nearly as willing to dedicate a zillion or whatever of their income, and it is for students who are, say, planning on being entrepreneurs, who are planning on being doctors, or planning on being business people, or hedge fund managers, or whatever. All of a sudden, that is something that they would take into account, and there are people like that. I think a lot of people. I mean, I didn't know I would be here when I entered college, so I would have been one of the people who would not have considered that, because I didn't know how much money I was going to earn, and I think most students are like that. But there are quite a few who do at least have some sort of hope to earn.
But beyond that, I think, Perry, you have the same limit on the maximum amount of income beyond which you need not pay Social Security or Medicare taxes. I think at some point people think that if you make $1 zillion, it would be sort of obscene to ask 5% or 20% of that $1 zillion. And so I think a cap is often put in place, not because I think people, I sort of buy Perry's point that people really don't know in advance that they're going to be Mark Zuckerbergs. And so I think if they need the money when they are in college, they'll probably sign on to this, but it will sort of just look awkward in the long run to be taking 5% of a huge amount. But the way to solve this, I mean, I presume you ran simulations, because the way to see how this program works is to sort of simulate this plan over a 20-30 year period and see what kind of surpluses or deficit it runs. And I presume you did that.
Oh yeah, okay. So I should have included the link up here, but visit FixUc.org. If you're a numbers person and you want to dig into the numbers, we have a data report in there that breaks down all of that stuff. All of the financial predictions. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head.
But look, I mean,
we broke out in different situations,
right,
like how much students would be contributing in different situations, how much revenue the UC would be getting. We broke all that out.
But if you look at it broadly, I mean, assume what you have to ask is 10 years after they graduate, what does a typical UC graduate make? And so if you're very conservative and say, okay, he or she makes $80,000 a year, 5% of 80 is $4,000, times 20 is $80,000. Now 80,000 is still a hell of a lot more than the $52,000 tuition that they would have paid.
You're not making, well, that's the thing, is you're not making $80,000 for the entire duration of your career. That you just said halfway through your career.
Right, but that's sort of, I'm sort of taking the 10-year average. So 20 years on, you'll be making even more, right? But roughly, it seems to me like this program, the way you've designed it, it would actually generate a lot of surplus for the UC.
Right.
So UC would come out further ahead than the current model.
Oh, absolutely. That was part of the point.
Yeah.
It was because with the UC funding going down like this, we have to do something about that. The UC needs enough revenue to grow in our depth, so we can attend, so our kids can attend, so we can have the classes that we need, so we're not fighting over classes every time registration happens, and we have all these different passes. And I mean, you all know this. You probably just went through it.
And
that's
you said something about in the beginning, you're going to be accepting more people, so that surplus would kind of decrease a little bit when you expand.
Right. Okay. So one of the things about the surplus was, and one of the questions I most often get is, would that lead to like crazy spending by the UC? Not necessarily. Or wouldn't that lead to like an incentive to like increase the amount that you're asking for students or whatever. But we built it in a way that there's an incentive to use that surplus to grow enrollment. That is, there's only so much that you can ask of a student. Like once you get up to 10 to 15%, that's the absolute limit that you can ask a student to contribute to their income. Now there's no limit to how much they can charge for tuition now, because as long as you have student loans, you can make sure that you have enough to front that cost whenever. But the way that we've structured it is there is an inherent incentive for the UC to instead use that additional revenue to grow the amount of students who are coming to UC.
Right.
And that's all part of the data report too. I don't
Okay, we should be wrapping up, but two quick questions. Sophia and then Dara.
I just have a question
Yeah.
about the students, the few students who do have trust funds and savings for college. Would they be required to join this program, or could they be the sticker prize?
So this program, that's a good question, applies to every single student, and it has to. In order for this to work, it has to have every student, because it's a strength in numbers kind of thing. The more people who are participating in the plan, the less everybody else can pay. In DC, the way I described it was the Netflix model, where Netflix, I pay $8 a month for Netflix, and I have access to thousands and thousands of movies, and I can watch them as much as I want. The amount of value that I get from Netflix increases as more people join Netflix, because it has more revenue to offer more content to people. 10 years ago, when Netflix started, or before Netflix started, if I wanted to watch a movie, I would pay that same $8 and I would watch one movie. And now I get to watch thousands for that same $8. And as more people join in, the more content and value I get. This model works the exact same way.
And would there be a cap on the amount of years you can attend this university? Because I know people who graduate in 3 years, but I also know that some people kind of take longer and graduate in 5, 6 years.
Right. Right.
Who
So
do
we're
you know
gonna,
that? Who do you know that
I don't
graduated
know.
in 3 years? It's impossible.
No, there's one, Deepan.
It takes an average of 4.5 to 5 years.
so that's getting into the nitty gritty of things, but there are small percentage increases that you would do. So like if you're gonna stay 5 or 6 years, we would tack on like another 0.3% or 0.5% onto that contribution.
But the other reason why you can't charge some people sticker price, in fact, you have to eliminate the whole notion of sticker price, because people then, the well-to-do people, lawyers who are making $200,000, $250,000 a year and who are paying 5%, at some point they'll say, look, these other guys paid $52,000 and now I'm already well past 52 and you still are asking for contributions from me. And so there will be some sort of resentment.
So
And
if we wouldn't know would you know the cost of the tuition?
now, you basically have to eliminate the whole notion of
Yeah,
the sticker.
that's part of the things you don't think about. Like that's not
Your sticker price is 5% of your income.
right, and that's and one of the things that's happening in higher ed now is we're looking at competition between universities, but it's hard to judge how competitive universities are in terms of their cost because everybody has different financial aid packages. If you look at, say, Harvard and UCR, even though the sticker prices are different, the financial aid packages are different, and it's very hard to compare the prices between the two and other institutions. But this, it simplifies it. Percentage and for how long. Every institution would be that way. You can clearly delineate between how much each is going to cost you. And so therefore you're simplifying the competitive process and building in incentive for institutions to keep that percentage low, because someone else can look and be like, okay, well I pay 4% here, 3% there, and that's it. Like that's as simple as it gets.
Dara, last
Well,
question.
it was a small question, now it's grown, so maybe I'll just hold on.
Maybe why don't you? Okay, on that note, let's thank Chris for a really. And you have, if people want to contact you afterwards,
Can
you have.
you read that?
Yeah, that's-
Because I
that's
can't
a-
really
Oh,
read
can you not see it? Yeah, it wasn't blue on my computer before. That's Chris at FICSamerica.org. I'm sorry about that. I wish there was a whiteboard in the mirror, there isn't. Chris, CHRIS, at
Fix America.
FixAmerica.org. FICS.